Today, we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to talk about the critical assessments you need to make before moving to a managed cloud solution, what questions you should ask your managed service provider to ensure that they meet your requirements and provide the level of service that you need, and how to prepare for the move, like including key steps you should take to make sure that that transition is as smooth as possible. I'm Trista Perot, Marketing Director, getting us started. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we kick it off. We're going to run the webinar close to an hour, but we'll be sure to leave time both during and at the end for any questions that you have. We'd love for you to put those in chat, and I'll be monitoring that. We also have a couple of our colleagues in chat monitoring. We are recording it in case you have to leave early, or maybe you just love it so much you want to go back and take notes and see it again. So it'll be available right away on our YouTube channel, but also you can find it on our websites within about a week. So quickly before I start, let me make sure that everybody knows who Dataprise is. Dataprise is a strategic managed service provider, and we offer innovative IT solutions and services that enable our clients to excel at their core business. Our service suite includes a number of things, including fully managed cloud, managed cybersecurity, managed user, 24/7 help desk, managed infrastructure, and more. We want to add extreme value to our clients by becoming their end-to-end technology partner. If you've done us previously as Global Data Vault, no fear, we're still providing the DRaaS, BaaS, and M365 backup offering as part of Dataprise. We were acquired at the very last moments of 2021. So nothing's changed. It's only gotten better. We continue our commitment to be the premier Veeam Platinum Cloud Services provider, offering solutions direct to our clients and through resellers. We pride ourselves at being specialists when it comes to Veeam, and we demonstrate that through our deep expertise and talented staff, which includes Veeam architects and a Veeam Vanguard and our close affiliation with the Veeam teams. And with that, let me start introducing our speakers. Since I mentioned Veeam Vanguard, I'm going to start there. Stephen, raise your hand. He's our operations director, who's our resident Veeam Vanguard and was just named to the 2023 class. So yay, let's give Stephen a round of applause. This is his second year in a row. And next we have Kelly Caldwell, who is our Senior Service Transition Manager. Kelly has a ton of experience onboarding clients, and in a previous life, maybe a little known fact, he was also a Veeam Channel Manager, and he's very familiar with all the questions that you may be thinking and having about moving to managed services. So let's keep that Veeam theme rolling and bookend it with our very, very special guest, Brandon Jurczyk, a senior systems engineer with Veeam, and this is a golden opportunity for you to ask him all of the really hard questions. So bring them on. We're going to keep this largely a discussion guided by our deck, so feel free to drop your questions into chat so we can address those as we go. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kelly. Let's talk about why organizations are looking for better data protection and what that actually means to them.
Cool. Thanks, Trista. Welcome, everybody. Since we're here to talk about managed cloud, data protection, availability, those types of things, it's important to start with a little bit of research and some facts. So every year, Veeam provides or produces a data protection trends report, and this is 2022's. 2023's will be out around the time of VeeamON in May, I believe. Trista just linked a copy of it in the chat there. So when we think about moving to the cloud, we always have to wonder about data protection. What are your RPOs and RPOs? We'll cover that, your recovery point objective, recovery time objective. What are the cost considerations? What are the operational considerations? Where will it even work? Why are organizations doing that? And the report does a really good job of breaking it down by organization size, by need, by thought processes, and that. So we'll cover a little bit of that today, but if you want the full report, just click on the link there in chat. So next up, we have 50% of organizations today we find are utilizing some type of managed backup. What you might see is backup as a service, compared to 42% that utilize cloud storage. Nearly half of that started with just a managed cloud storage before they went to backup as a service, right? So when you think about that, the differentiator there is really the as a service part. And that's something where Dataprise has continued to excel in providing the service to end users, customers, et cetera. And you get into the mentality when you think about the cloud of who's going to be on the other end of the phone. If I need help with something, who will answer my call? Who will answer my questions? And when you kind of go it on your own and you're just looking for some storage out there, that's really all you get. You just get a chunk of storage and it's yours to do with whatever you like. So when you add a BaaS provider, you really are adding a bit of service, adding somebody there with expertise. And that is one of the things that's mentioned in this report. So typically managed service providers, right, like Dataprise, will deliver services with ongoing support, the network operation centers and help desks, et cetera. But the services behind those, some kind of managed infrastructure, managed server, managed backup, managed disaster recovery, are bundled into that. Initially, they were developed to manage and monitor on-premises technologies, the on-premises servers and workstations, switches, and all of that. And over time, it's developed into more of a mixed hybrid cloud, only consume as you will practice. Managed service providers have expertise in all the areas that you may or may not have in your organization. If you do have that expertise, it's great to have somebody else there to back you up, pun intended, but also if you don't have the staff, or if you're looking at different ways to use your resources effectively, you can augment that with a service provider to bring in the extra expertise. And of course, when you get into crunch time or you need some extra hands, maybe your folks are too busy working on projects for the business, managed service providers are scalable, and we bring a different level of, a different number of employees that can help you with your organizational needs. So when we go past the managed service provider part, we think about a BaaS and DRaaS evaluation checklist. So I'm going to bring in Stephen and Brandon here, right? So backup as a service, disaster recovery as a service, the evaluation checklist. What are we talking about with the assessment and strategies? Stephen, do you want to start? Can't hear you, Stephen.
Sorry, a little bit of technical difficulties there. It always happens.
He's great with backup and disaster recovery, ladies and gentlemen. The microphones.
Yeah. So the assessment is going to be an infrastructure assessment to determine what you do need to back up. That's going to be your first task in your evaluation checklist, is assess what you need to back up, what critical applications you have, what servers in your environment are critical to your business if your business were to go down. And you need to look at it from a standpoint of what happens if a tornado takes my building out and it does not exist. What would I need to replicate in the cloud to make sure my business has zero downtime? So you're going to need to assess any financial systems, SQL servers, domain controllers. If you're running any cloud-based applications, can those communicate with your DR environment? These are going to need to be a part of your assessment to make sure that your users can perform their job duties if your site no longer exists. You also need to review your current strategy to understand what you are currently doing. I would probably do the assessment and then look at your current strategy to see what is missing and then fill in the pieces, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Veeam's talked about the availability gap for a while now, which is basically what you're saying. It's the expectations of a product or the solution that you have versus what they'll actually deliver. And you don't necessarily know the expectations until you sit down and define what those services and those needs are. We've done some other webinars and things about business impact analysis, so check those out on the website for more information there. Brandon, when you're dealing with Veeam customers, what do you see as gaps in their strategy?
So a lot of the customers that I see that their gaps is that they created a plan 5 years ago. They created a plan 10 years ago, and they never looked back. It's kind of they kind of went with the if it ain't broke, don't fix it type mentality. And in today's industry, a lot of that is tribal knowledge. It is they had one guy that set it all up. Well, he's retired or he's moved on, and they never went back to look at that plan. Infrastructure's changed, storage changes, going from physical to virtual. You really have to, kind of take a holistic look at your infrastructure from a very wide spectrum, at least once every year, kind of go through and see what has changed, what image has been created, what our network looks like, and reevaluate your recovery time objective and your recovery point objective. And that is basically defined as like, how long can your company afford to be down and what steps you're going to take or need to take to get back up and running, whether that is from a complete infrastructure recovery or to a bare bones recovery, and what steps you have to take to get to that point. I mean, a lot of customers, like they're lacking in that execution part of it.
Yeah, I believe you mentioned tape. Does anybody here still use tape?
Like Scotch tape on Christmas presents, but
couple of hands up in the audience there, but just complacency, right? So if you're still using tape, the ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. Sure, you might be able to write a backup to that tape. You may be able to restore just fine from it, but for today's business needs, it's not going to be fast enough. You're not going to get the availability. You're not going to get that uptime. You're certainly not going to get any kind of disaster recovery out of it unless you have the exact same equipment sitting there waiting to restore from the tape. Hopefully the tape works and hasn't melted or deteriorated over time, as magnetic tape tends to do, but you just don't know. So when we talk about that and we're thinking of the disasters, how do we prepare for and define the disaster? Some of that's going to be in the needs assessment, right, Stephen? So to define a disaster, what do we typically talk to customers about? And again, it changes over time. Where it used to be maybe a tornado, today it includes a lot more things.
Yeah, so this is a tricky question because a disaster, when you define a disaster, people are thinking hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, but you also have to consider any insider threats and outsider threats. Ransomware is a disaster. A disgruntled employee going in and encrypting all your computer systems is a disaster. Things that are not really considered a disaster is, let's say you lose power for 2 hours, or you have a fiber cut and it's going to take 3 hours to get your your internet service restored. So when you define a disaster, it's very tricky because if you lose power for a week, that is a disaster. Your business cannot operate. We will bring you up in our environment and provide you access to your servers. If you lose power for 2 hours, yes, you will have some downtime and some risk, but that would not essentially be considered a disaster. So when we define disaster, will it affect the operations of your company for a long period? If it does, and then you're losing revenue because of that outage, then those are things that you need to consider when you define a disaster. If you lose internet for a day or two, yes, we will bring you up if needed, but we have to be careful when we define the word disaster because people are thinking tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, not thinking about the bigger picture of, my internet provider accidentally cut a fiber line. I'm not going to have internet for 2 weeks. That's a disaster. Your business cannot function without internet for 2 weeks. Or somebody hit a power pole and knocked it into the lake, and I'm not going to have power for a week. That's a disaster. So we need to get away from using, we need to get away from the tornadoes, the hurricanes, because there are different disasters out there that aren't technically considered a natural disaster that would cause your business not to function or operate.
Yeah, and hopefully if power outages like that or internet outages are potential where you are, if that's going to affect your business, hopefully you've planned for that and you're in more of a robust data center with multiple power streams, multiple internet connections / providers. Those things aren't going to be an issue for you. So definitely for sure need to take that into consideration. So when we talk about evaluating providers, we had the managed service provider before that. Now we're talking sort of a checklist. We have some questions. We have some things to do to evaluate providers. And one of the things is to ask them and understand, maybe if you need a little extra clarification, what's the difference between BAS and DRAS? Talk about SLAs, and we'll come back and go through these in just a second with Brandon and Stephen. But what's your retention schedule? What technology do you use? How can I view my status? How do I know if this stuff is working? And how do I open a ticket? All of these are valid questions. So, Brandon, for your exposure, did customers intertwine BAS and DRAS? Do they make maybe not a mistake, but do they get that confused a little bit?
Well, I think a lot of people will use BAS DRAS as one word, one term, where it's not. A true DR as a service is kind of what we touched on earlier, being able to have someone manage a solution for you to where we can be able to come back up online in a matter of minutes. It is a replica of my data going from point A to point B and having it, what I call, in a warm state. And whereas a backup as a service is literally just backing up your data and putting it somewhere. The data itself, not utilizing and having those, virtual machines with CPU and RAM and the OS just sitting there and constantly writing to it to just turn on in a matter of minutes. It's a huge difference. It's a pyramid of data protection, in my opinion, to where you look at, your BAS offering, for a customer, that's your foundation. It's got to have that, to even move up. And then, you layer on another layer of DR, and that's your secondary layer. And then you can get into business continuity, which is almost a real-time replication of your data. Somebody makes a change on server 1, it's automatically replicated to, server 1A living somewhere else. So it is still, in this market, an educational standpoint, like educating customers on the differences of those service offerings, how they can do it themselves, and how it's actually more beneficial to leverage a data prize to manage that for you, because it can snowball and you can be, for lack of a better term, be caught with your pants down very quickly in that scenario.
Yeah. And it's important for folks to remember that when you talk about the as a service part of that, there's really not a lot of as a service with the backup stuff, right? It's really, here's your copy, we make it available for you, we use whatever software you choose to use, but it's up to you to restore it. Whereas disaster recovery as a service, you're going to get us involved and turning on systems and making sure you have network connectivity, and et cetera. So we've got to be able to measure that with something like an SLA. So Stephen, can you just real quickly tell us what our standard SLA is and how that plays out for customers?
So our standard SLA in the cloud is we run the backups every night and we replicate the last restore point that's in your repository, which is normally about, if Dataprize provides your local backups, your last restore point is probably going to be about 8 p.m. And then we replicate that to the cloud. So our standard retention is 10 dailies, 3 weeklies, 3 monthlies. And then we also have 5 days worth of EDP, or enhanced data protection, that is stored in a near gap device that is where you do not have access to for your ransomware or your malware protection, or even insider threat, delete your backup. So our standard SLA is normally about 8 hours on your RPO, and your RTO is about 4 hours. So essentially that means we have 4 hours to get your data up, and your data can be 8 hours old in the cloud, which is why we run it once a day.
Yep. Great. And that ties along with the retention schedule. What kind of needs do you have for retention? And obviously different customers are going to have different needs, but it's important to understand what type of retention you can get. Is it one thing? Is it customizable? Does it cost more to get certain things? Will the technology even allow me to do what I need to do with it? So what technology is used and why? It could be that, Brandon's my brother and he works for Veeam, and I'm going to buy Veeam products. And I love Veeam products. I've been using them for more years than I can remember. But you don't necessarily want to make a decision because of a tie like that. You want to look at the functions, the features, make sure that it delivers what you need as a business. And then the other thing related to the SLA, the retention and the technology working, is how can you view the status? Something that customers want is not only to know that their jobs were successful, but that the data is recoverable and that it's within an SLA, right? So again, if you have a disaster, if you have an issue with your backups, how do you open a ticket? I'm going to pause here. Scott's asked 2 great questions. I'll get to the first one in a second, but let's go over this one here. What would a customer do to potentially fill that 8-hour gap, Stephen?
So, as Kelly mentioned, we do offer different SLAs. To fill that 8-hour gap, you could go with our replication product, which could get your SLA down to 1 hour. And then that also ties us back to what technology is used and why. The reason why I'm pointing that out is because replication is a VMware to VMware replication that uses Veeam as the transport. So your VMs have to be able to take a snapshot. Your pipe has to be able to send that snapshot through the Veeam transport to our vCenter server or our VMware server on our side within that hour period. But to answer your question, Scott, we have a product called Veeam Replication that could fill in the 8-hour gap for your non-critical servers, your critical servers. And then we would recommend putting your non-critical servers in the daily remote job, which would be an RPO of 8 hours.
Yeah, and it's important to make the distinction that when we talk about getting data offsite, we use Veeam's backup copy jobs to copy that data, and Veeam Replication is a different technology, different product, different capabilities. And you can also use things depending on your infrastructure. You can use storage snapshots, which are not backups, but they're good things to fill in those different time gaps when you may not be running a backup. If you just needed the capability to restore a file or recover something from that, you can run storage snapshots maybe at the SAN level to keep your RPOs and certain things down, and then use the Veeam backups, which can also tie in with your storage snapshots to get a true backup of that. And then we do a backup copy job to get it offsite. So lots of different options. It's another one of those, it depends. It depends on your infrastructure, depends on what your service provider uses and what technology is available. So thanks for that question. Moving on, we have a little follow-up to one of those questions about frequency and retention. So we talked about this a little bit. I don't know how much time we need to spend, but how often do you back up? The considerations are more backups mean more storage, more resources, right? And that does affect your RPO recovery point objective, depending on how frequently or infrequently you're taking them. Here's an interesting point that we see, especially now, Brandon, when you talked about if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If we've been using this certain method for whatever, how fast do you need to restore your data? How quickly can you recover from that tape? How quickly can you have this mindset of I've got a USB drive, or I have this server with one huge hard drive in it, right? What does that look like from a data restoration? How do we
Yeah, so that goes back to the question of when asking that question to your service providers, like what kind of infrastructure, what kind of hardware do you use? Veeam plays very well with the multitude of vendors. I mean, there's lists out there, and we're not going to bore you with those. But I mean, it is kind of a get what you pay for scenario. I mean, you have the very high I/O storage arrays that can have you up in a matter of minutes. I mean, you have your cloud providers that it's almost instantaneously the time it takes to actually power on the VM and the OS to boot. So it all kind of falls into what you have, what you need, and what you can afford. And utilizing and leveraging service providers, and with the Veeam product, we can tailor you a solution that best fits your company's SLAs to be successful in accomplishing filling this need.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever heard me say this before, but the more nines you add to something, the more dollars you add to something.
Exactly.
Right? So the business needs are really what drive that. Again, if you think you need 5 nines, go look and see how expensive it is, and then maybe 3 is okay. But it's really your applications. When you do that business impact analysis or your assessment, you're going to set dollar amounts per application or customer employee impact, brand recognition, those types of things to downtime. And that's really how you're going to come up with a strategy for your data protection and your disaster recovery based on that.
I mean, you can look at industries to the fact that, if you're, let's say, a fabrication company, you spend all day building one part for an airplane or for construction, this and that. I mean, you can afford to be down for a day or two, because you can go build that. It takes a day or two to build that part. So you can look at having a more of a cost-effective solution for your backups and your DR. Whereas you are an e-commerce site, like an Amazon, or what's that site my wife, Lululemon, you can't afford to be down for more than a minute. So I mean, you're looking at a very cost-effective high 9 solution to where you're going to want to be back up and running as soon as possible.
Yeah, and all those considerations do play into your recovery time objective, your recovery point objective needs. So when we talk about that, let's look at some best practices. Our standard here at DataPrize, and this is just the default standard, is 10 dailies, 3 weeklies, and 3 monthlies in the cloud. It differs versus what we have on site a little bit versus the cloud, and it does use GFS, grandfather, father, son, to roll weeklies into monthlies and monthlies into yearlies, et cetera. All of that is handled automatically in the magic that is Veeam. Brandon or Steven, I don't know if you guys want to arm wrestle for talking about the zip code. Steven, why don't you take a stab at it?
Well, sure. This is actually also called the Veeam Golden Rule, which you need to store 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of media, one offsite, one offline with 0 errors. What that essentially means is you don't want to have 1 copy of your data, have a disaster, and not be able to access your data. I mean, that's why you need to have 3 copies. Let's say your Veeam server on site goes down, you lose 2 of your copies. That's why you want 1 offsite. You get hit by ransomware, everything's encrypted on site. That's where 1 of your offline copies will help. You always want 2 types of media. If your hard drives in your Veeam server fails, you'll have that secondary media to fall back to if you need to restore a backup. And everybody knows that you want 0 errors. So if your backups are failing, they're not going to do you any good. So that's why you need to make sure that you have 0 errors on your backups so that you do have the peace of mind that you will be able to restore if you were to have an event that you would need the data to be restored.
Yeah, and we always look at worst case scenario, right? And I still find customers today that will house their backups on the same storage that their production data is on, all your eggs in one basket. And sure, the hardware standards of today, the inevitability of a complete failure or any kind of a failure on that array that would completely render it useless is very low, but it's not 0. And we also talk about data corruption and things like that can happen. We look at the worst possible case, and you want to plan for that. And this, what used to be the 3-2-1 rule, and now the zip code, is a best practice to eliminate any single point of failure, whether it's your production environment, your backup environment, your site, your data center, or even the cloud, because you'll still have your on-premises backups. Brandon, anything to add to that?
Yeah, the one thing that I was going to add to it is the 0, in my opinion, should have been there since the beginning. It should have always been 3-2-1-0, because if you don't take the time to check, test, and lab your backups and make sure that they are working and you can recover to it, it's not a complete solution. I mean, you have to be able, what you're paying for, you have to make sure it works. The offline solution is, I would say the newest kid on the block, with the way that ransomware and cyber attacks have just exploded, post and pre-COVID. It's almost needed. I mean, we see a huge repatriation of people like dusting off the tape drives. Like, hey, we need an offline air gap solution to satisfy this need. We're going back to tape. I mean, one of my solutions architects, he's a big tape guy. He's an old school guy. He'll preach it all day long. So,
shout out Joe.
So making sure that, those 2 things are added may seem like a little more redundancy, but they are very valid in having a successful solution that works.
Yeah, those are all great points. Additional questions to ask your service provider might be around recovery. And we already talked about defining a disaster, but we didn't talk about maybe fees yet. So it's important to understand and ask your provider, are there any types of fees for recovery? Any man hours, any labor charges, any bandwidth bursting, any kind of disk utilization? Depending on the service provider, they may have a different fee structure. And so I'm going to pause here and go back to Scott Ellman's first question. You all try to equate disasters with dollar amounts when presenting a customer with a BAS-DRAS solution and what's worth it to them. For us at Dataprise, the cost difference between BAS and DRAS is fairly negligible. We tend to configure things much the same way, again, to best practice. We're still getting copies of the backups off-site. And with the DRAS scenario, we simply turn that into full-blown disaster recovery as a service. We can do that pretty easily and with a very easy fee structure. So that's one thing to ask about that. So equating disasters with dollar amounts when presenting a customer with the BAS and DRAS topic is going to really go back to how much time can you tolerate? How much downtime can you tolerate? Let's leave the cyber part of it off of it for just a second, and let's just stick to like natural disasters. So, Stephen, we support customers in areas of the country that have frequent hurricanes. When we talk to them about that, what do we typically say? How do we equate that to dollar amounts and what's worth it to them?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we're going to go back to first of all, we're going to need to understand what your business does. And also, to get to the dollar amount, we're going to need to understand much money you lose if you're down for, let's say, an hour, or if you're down for 4 hours. What would the impact be if you were down for a complete day? These are going to be questions that they're going to ask during the business impact analysis, which can help you equate the disaster to the dollar amount. We had a customer who was hit by ransomware, and they were losing $1 million a day. So we had to bring them up fairly quickly, make sure that they were in production so that they would stop losing money, because $1 million a day, if you're down for 2 days, you could essentially be out of business. So we need to know, when gathering this information for the BIA, the dollar amounts is going to be per business, if that makes sense, because you could be in a different business than the customer that was losing $1 million a day. I mean, if you're a CPA, a construction crew, I mean, there's different industry sectors that could lose more amounts of money than others, if that makes sense. So I would highly recommend that if you haven't done a business impact analysis, that you do it so that we can determine what is your best options for recovery if you were to go down.
Yeah, and we have to think of it additionally as in like people costs, FTE, employee cost. If they can't work, you still have to pay them. You've lost productivity there. Maybe you have a limited budget, and disaster recovery as a service becomes a better OpEx option for you than paying another person who is an expert in backups and disaster recovery. When you opt for an as a service, what you're paying for is, what you see here. If we were a 3-person, 4-person company, you'd be paying for the expertise of 4 people and the support of these 4 people at one OpEx cost versus trying to find somebody who can do that for you. And then Brandon mentioned at one point, there was somebody who's been there for 15 years and they have that intrinsic knowledge, and that person leaves. You're stuck with a huge gap. Not only now are you trying to figure out how your backups work and if they are working, but how to use it, any of the systems that were set up that way. So a lot of equations there to digest. In addition to the ransomware part, you have to think about paying the ransom itself. If those hackers get a hold of your backups, which they tend to aim for immediately, you have no choice but to pay the ransom to get it back. Unless you go with the Data Prize solution, we have enhanced data protection, which I think we're going to talk about later. Brandon, do you have anything to add to Scott's question?
No, that you guys covered most of it there. So, I mean, the biggest part of it is, understanding what that value of their time is. It's going to be different. Every customer is going to be different.
Yeah.
There's no.
Give me follow-up questions, please. Yeah. Please feel free to type them in, and we'll get to them.
There's no cookie cutter questionnaire when it comes to this situation.
Yeah, it's always great to remember. One size doesn't necessarily fit all. So, how frequently do I get a DR test? Is another thing. They may offer some at cost. They may offer none. Is it included? Is it not? Stephen, can you real quick describe what our DR tests are like?
Sure. So what we do is we provide you one full hands-on DR test a year. And what we like to call that, or what I like to call it, is you basically kicking the tires of your infrastructure. We are going to be bringing up all your servers. We're going to be segmenting those into your own little network bubble, provide you with VPN access to it. And we request that you go off-site, do not test from your production environment or even in the building. Go to a restaurant, hotel, Starbucks, and connect to their Wi-Fi and VPN in and make sure that you can work. Because essentially you want to make sure that you can function as you were connected to your VPN. So if everything works when you are connected to our VPN, you're able to do your SQL queries, run your applications, get to your web portals. That is what we want you to test. But to answer the question, you do get one full hands-on test a year. And during that full DR test, we recommend that you go in and you test it as hard as you can to make sure every single item that you need functions properly. Before you do the test, I would probably go through a task list on what you do during the day and you just create a list of things that you want to test. Can you perform SQL queries? Can you get to this database? Can you get to SharePoint? Whatever you do on a normal daily basis, write that down and do those during the test.
Yep, those are good points. So next question, I'm going to try to move through these just a little bit quicker and so we can get to some capacity planning discussions. Today, we mentioned cybersecurity. That's a big thing and it's on everybody's mind. It's front and foremost. So you always want to ask, how secure is your data? Is it encrypted, and when and where? So best practice on that and what we provide is encrypted at rest and in flight. So it's at rest, encrypted on your site, in your data centers, as it copied to our cloud, and it sits encrypted in our cloud. You want to understand what the security posture of your managed services provider is. If you have questions about your own security postures or what you can do to improve that, DataPrize can help you with that. We have managed cybersecurity services available. All of our data is protected multiple ways through EDR, through SIEM. We have enhanced data protection in place, which is a couple of slides ahead to really thwart insider threats or ransomware attacks. And then who has access to the data? Do we let anybody who walks in the door have access to the data? Can they go in and touch the servers? Does the admin person have the ability to log into a machine that has my backups on it? Those types of things, MFA, all of that are good questions to ask. And then the future is kind of the last set of questions. What if you wanted to move to another provider? You probably wouldn't, but if you should, that's a question to ask. How do we scale as your needs grow? What can the service provider do to accommodate those? And again, how do you define a disaster? Just thinking about the future. Again, you'll hear that as a repetitive question, right? So it's something that you need to make sure that you're asking as a business. So this was recorded. So if you want to go back and play that in slow motion, feel free to. But I did want to get to the capacity planning here because this is a bit of a misnomer or another little point of confusion. So Stephen and Brandon, we'll start with Stephen and we can just have a little bit of a conversation. What do you guys see as best practices, starting with a tiered approach for backups?
Well, first of all, you want to create multiple tiered jobs. You want to create a critical and non-critical job. You want to put your critical servers, obviously, in a job that runs more often. And then that way, if these servers, we recommend that you run your critical servers every 4 hours on your main job. But if they are business critical, then we recommend that you put those on 1 hour replication jobs. And then you obviously want to store your non-critical machines. So some people actually have templates of machines that they just want to get a one-time backup of. Just throw it in the cloud, forget about it, just in case their building does get hit by a tornado. They have something to fall back on. Stuff like that, you can store on less expensive storage. Maybe store them on slower disk to where they wouldn't need to be accessed that frequent.
Yeah, Brandon, what do you see from like a cloud-based standpoint? I mean, obviously that's what we provide here, right? What do you see?
Prioritization is always going to be like your primary question. What servers need to be backed up, how often, and how quickly do we need to access that data? And a cloud solution, now that the way that the cloud is going with storage vendors and their storage types, I mean, there's multitude of options in that arena. I mean, you still have your basic block storage. You have your S3 object storage. That's the new kid on the block. Its dedupe and compression and speed is, best in class right now. But also, like Stephen was talking about, if you have those templates or you have just that old server that we got to keep for HIPAA or SOC 2 compliance and this and that, we need to take one backup a month of it. You have your Glacier or like your Blob, your really cold storage, so you're just going to park that there for a year and we're not going to touch it. A lot of our partners will tier those storage tiers out in their backup solution. They'll have their main priority ones living in what we call a performance tier, which is your latest and greatest, your fastest. A capacity tier being more than likely an object storage type bucket. And then the archive will go off into the cold dark night of the Glacier storage aspect of it because they don't need to access it. Being able to tier that out from a storage perspective and then also from a VM or a server perspective is one of the things that we do very well as a software provider. And then you guys do well working with the partners and creating that document, that process, and helping them identify how it should work.
When we talk about capacity, we also don't want to forget, much like the cost isn't just applications and downtimes, it's also people. So by automating backup and recovery processes as much as possible, we are reducing the capacity from a worker standpoint. I can only click so many things at one time, well, at least to do it well. I can only do so many tasks before I'm at my capacity and we need another person. So automating a lot of those processes is really helpful to reduce the time and efficiency in which you can restore things, recover things. We have a lot of our processes automated with some manual guidance and manual inputs to just steer things along. But basically, in the event of a disaster, we can click a few things and the build process happens. Make sure the network connectivity and all that comes up, and we get customers working as quickly as possible. Also serves to reduce the amount of human error that we might introduce into the process just by being who we are. And then the last thing for it, you can back up as many things as you want. Without monitoring and testing of those, you don't know what you have, right? So it's always important to do that. Preparing for the move to a managed service provider or a cloud provider, we've talked multiple times about defining things, identify which applications are most critical. People often don't think about this, but the patching strategy, which we have another webinar on, I think from last year, maybe the year before, make sure your servers are patched, especially when you're going to implement this, because when we back them up and copy them to the cloud, they're going as they are. And if they're in an unpatched state, then it's possible that those systems will try to apply missing Windows updates when they boot, or you'll be behind service revisions when you boot. Your applications may not work properly. You could be leaving yourself at risk, exposing yourself to additional flaws that way. So make sure you're patching those servers. Train your employees on the new processes and procedures. Brandon mentioned, make sure that you don't update that document once every 10 years. Make sure that you're doing it annually, quarterly, whatever makes sense for your business. And then assign a point of contact in the event of disaster. Make sure you have a call tree and who's contacting who's doing what, who's going to contact Stephen for help, and make hard copies of those. So Stephen, the next thing that we want to talk about is our enhanced data protection, right? Disaster recovery as a service needs to be managed and it needs to be protected. Can you talk to us about how enhanced data protection works and how it can help our customers?
Yeah, so basically the enhanced data protection, what it is it's a copy outside of your repository. We do keep 5 days by default. And you're in this, we're not going to call it air gapped, we're going to call it near gapped because it's on the same disk, just outside of where you can access. So when we do your annual DR test, we test your data off the EDP data, the enhanced data protection. The reason for that is because we first of all want to make sure that the data is intact and functioning properly, and we want to get you your annual test without impacting your primary chain. Normally, whenever we bring you up and we build off the primary chain of the cloud data, it isn't able to merge or perform any consolidations while the VBM or the metadata is locked. So we perform a test on your EDP data to verify its functioning, to make sure your primary chain continues to run, and to get your annual test in. We do have the ability to fill over to our remote data centers, whether it be in Dallas or Vegas. And then we are able to provide you with VPN access into that data center to access your data. So enhanced data protection is another copy of the data that is offline that you cannot access, that normally is used when you're hit in a ransomware malware attack.
Next question for your service provider, next consideration is protecting data again across all clouds. So no matter where your data lives, public cloud, private cloud, on-premises, SaaS, PaaS, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, need to be able to protect a multitude of things because people today are consuming workloads in different ways, right? May use this for that, DevOps over here, some application development over here, and we just need to make sure that you have a cohesive protection strategy. So I know that we've covered a lot. Sorry for going through some of it a little quick. I just wanted to make sure that we had enough time to answer questions or rehash anything. Trista, what do we have?
Well, first of all, awesome to all three of you. That was a really interesting discussion. I do have a couple of questions here that I was sent. First one, if my company is down for 4 hours due to a power outage, why would I not want to spin it up in the cloud? Is it too difficult to fail back
So the reason why you want to spin it up in the cloud is, yes, you do have to sell it back. We have to, when we bring you up in the cloud, it's not just a light switch where you flip on and flip off. We bring you up, we network your servers, we provide you with VPN access, and then we put those in a backup job here at our data center. And we always follow Veeam's 3-2-1 rule. So we create you a main job, a backup copy. And then once your power is back on, what we would do is we would have you bring up a Veeam server or a server that we can use to install Veeam on. And then we would reverse the roles. We would basically send the data down from our cloud to you. Can we spin you up if you're down for 4 hours? Yes. You're going to have to determine if the cost of being down for 4 hours is great enough to bring you up. If you're losing $1 million a day in revenue, then yes, we would bring you up. But that is going to be a decision that you would need to make as a business if you need to be brought up or not. Our technicians do not determine that.
Yep.
So if you call and say, hey, I just lost power, they're not going to say, oh, well, how long is it going to be? That's not what they're going to say. They're going to automatically start working on bringing you up.
Yeah. You have to think of a DR scenario from a customer standpoint that, to initiate a DR scenario, it is still a manual process. And the way that I explain it to customers, it is the break the glass and push the big red button. There's consequences that are involved in it to put that kind of an action plan in place, no matter if it's an hour a day, kind of like Stephen alluded to, whatever your cost of being down is. It is a major task. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, and then there's a lot that is required to fail back to your on-prem infrastructure. So it needs to be valid. It can't be a cry wolf scenario. That is something that we tease out in the planning process.
Yeah, I've talked about Hollywood Magic a lot, and Hollywood hurts the disaster recovery folks and a lot of times computer people and IT folks in general, because you see people just going somewhere and magically their fingers are flying over their keyboard and stuff is fixed and working, and oh, look, the world is safe. That's not how reality works, folks. Like, there's no Hollywood magic there. It's the internet, it's spinning parts, it's electronics, and we kind of have to abide by those laws too.
And my wife hates watching tech movies with me because I'm like, nope, that's fake. No, just watch the movie.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have two more. Is there a tool that I can use to plan out my storage needs?
Sure. There's a bunch of them. We have I keep plugging our stuff, but we have another webinar where we discussed free tools, all kinds of things from capacity planning to how many hard drives do I need? How much storage do I need locally? What type of storage would I need in the cloud? And the answer still, again, is going to be it depends, Stephen. So if we're talking how many copies of the data, how many days do you keep it where, how often do you back up? What's your change rate, right? Like, what tool is good for that?
There's several tools for that, but we normally use some calculators to determine that. Change rate, how often you should back up. But there isn't going to be a standard answer to that because we do use multiple tools to get that information, but you can find calculators online that would get you that information.
I think Veeam has one that's the Restore Simulator or Restore Point Simulator.
Yeah, that's normally the one that we use is the Restore Simulator that is on Veeam's website. And
we have that one, and we have one built into AWS and Azure as well.
Yeah.
So you guys use that one quite a bit.
Yeah, so we just plug the numbers in and it'll spit it out for you.
Cool.
Pretty cool stuff.
Okay, and then the last one's a little bit longer question, but I think I'm good on summarizing it. So if someone is cost sensitive, I think this is just a pure backup question, and they're looking at the cost of Azure. I think they're weighing whether they should just back up to Azure or what's the additional value of a managed service.
Do you want to start with that one, Brandon, or do you want me to?
Go for it. Because I think you bring out the same answer. It'd be better coming from you.
It's kind of like that. What I said at the beginning. I'd like to come up with weird metaphors and things like that. So you can hire somebody to mow your grass, or you can hire somebody who will mow your grass, trim your hedges, do your mulch, shovel your snow, aerate your lawn, do all of this. It's kind of the same way with just storage. It's just a place to put stuff, and you're going to have to continue to grow that and do what you will. but you're going to have to manage how do you access that data and from where. What kind of support do you have if you have any issues accessing that data or have any questions? How do you know the viability of that data? Are you doing any kind of testing? Is there any kind of health checks or consistency checks that happen as you're copying that data to the cloud? Do you have any type of compliance regulations that require you to keep the data in a certain region of the United States? Does the cloud provider that you're using honor that? Do you know where your data is at all times, and do you maintain control of it? Who has access to that data? There's all kinds of different levels of uncertainties or questions that you can build into it. And then again, you're relying on you or your company, your employees, to do all of the work yourself. So when the rubber meets the road, you may be left standing by the side because you weren't able to do everything you needed to do. Brandon?
Yeah, I mean I was going to go with the change your oil metaphor, but you did mowing the yard, so I mean we're kind of right there. Taking my sales hat off, my webinar. I mean, just speaking as a true engineer, I've sat in that seat. I've ran those backup solutions. Public cloud does not have your best interest at heart. That's the brass tacks of it. So you as an end user go and say, hey, I want to use Azure to put my storage there. Cool. I mean, if you don't have someone on your payroll that is working in Azure daily and managing that infrastructure, it's not a safe solution, because Azure at that point, owns your data. They can move it wherever. You don't know where it is. If you have compliances that you have to meet and you don't tease that out in the beginning, they can do whatever. And so with leveraging, a service provider for them to really kind of keep your best interests at heart and managing that infrastructure is a better way to go. It's a more secure way to go. It's less painless, and not getting into pricing scenario, but it could be cheaper just because of the amount of business that a Dataprize does with an Azure than just kind of Joe off the street going to it. You're going to get a better product for a better price.
Yeah,
better solution.
And we certainly are not naysaying anything public cloud. We use a lot of Azure public cloud solutions. We have managed public cloud solutions. It's more, but again, we're talking about the managed. It's a service that we provide. We have the expertise to do all of that for you and to assist you with those decision-making processes. So it's more along the lines of having that little bit of extra help to get you through whatever you may need.
Yeah, having that expertise with these guys, through an email or through a Teams chat or pick up the phone and call them, is an invaluable tool than having to have someone on-prem or have to, spend half the day Googling a scenario, and heaven forbid you have to call Microsoft and pay for their pro services. I've been down all of those roads, and at the end of the day, it's having a service provider looking after your data is a great option to choose.
Cool. Well, I think we're about on time, Trista. Do we have any other questions? Maybe we need to answer those in a blog post or something.
We are done, actually. Those are all the questions that I had, but I would like to say thank you to everyone who's joined us. If you have an idea for a future webinar, or you do have a question once we shut this one down, feel free to email me at marketing@dataprize.com, and I will, if I can't answer it, I will get you into the right resource. So Kelly plugged our previous webinars a whole lot. So thank you for that, Kelly. And so I want to let everybody know that you can find a library of all of our previous webinars at globaldatavault.com/webinars. And we've got summaries of all the previous ones. You can also register to be notified of future webinars there. You can also find webinars at dataprize.com/resources/webinars. Or you can also follow us on social media and our YouTube channels. So again, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Have a good day. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great one.